My conclusions are the result of information from many different sources, plus what I am seeing with my own eyes in following the planetary alignments, that the infrastructure of the world was built by the same advanced civilization up until relatively recently, and that the very positive timeline of humanity is missing from the collective memory. My name is Michelle Gibson. I can't definitively prove what I'm going to say, and that you can't go to a book and look it up. However, awareness of this information has come up for me synchronistically and intuitively, and I can definitely give you the evidence for why I believe this to be true. All of my life I have been collecting puzzle pieces related to this subject, and the universe made sure that I had everything I needed to be able to put this puzzle together. This is the star tetrahedron I found in 2010 by connecting cities that lined up in North America that led me to uncovering much of the information I am sharing with you in this video. Drawn below Melchizedek's video, Birth of a New Humanity, in 2010, gave me my first clue that a planetary grid even existed. In the video, he introduces the work of Carl Monk. Carl deciphered a shared mathematical code related to the pyramids of Giza and the dimensions of the architecture of sacred sites all over the planet, one which encodes longitude and latitude of each that cross-reference other sites. He shows that this pyramid code is clearly sophisticated and intentional, and perfectly aligned over long distances. At the time this got my interest, and I thought, wow, that sounds great, but who could have built it? Drunvalo didn't really answer that question in the video, but he planted a seed in my consciousness. So, from what I have come to understand, from these sources and others, this positive timeline started after the fall of Atlantis, at which time the physical infrastructure of the planetary grid started to be built according to sacred geometry and along the lines of the flower of life pattern. And I think this ancient civilization lasted until 1942 on what would have been a different timeline or something comparable to that year in this timeline. In this video, I will explain exactly why I believe this. During the ensuing millennia after the fall of Atlantis, this advanced ancient civilization, which I believe was in unity consciousness, terraformed the earth, used geomancy to groom the ley lines and create balance and harmony between heaven and earth, and built all of the infrastructure of the planet, including, besides buildings, rivers, lakes, waterfalls, and canals. The ancient civilization created infrastructure that would be considered ancient. This is Bell Rock in Sedona, Arizona. People think of red rocks all over the world as natural, but I see this as ancient infrastructure. These could be extremely ancient, predating the fall of Atlantis, and go back to Lemuria, also known as Mu, but there would be a direct connection between these two civilizations. The Washita Moors, also known as the Ancient Ones, still exist to this day, and have been recognized by the UN as the oldest indigenous civilization on Earth, but for some reason the general public has never heard of them. Washita proper, the ancient imperial seat, is in northern Louisiana, in and around Monroe. The ancient civilization created infrastructure that would be considered medieval. The cloisters of Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy, France, come up as an example of medieval architecture, and this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is compared with a colonnade with similar features at the Alhambra in Granada, Spain, architecture that the Moors are given credit for. They created infrastructure that would be considered Renaissance. This is the Duomo in Florence compared with the Seville Cathedral in Spain, with the ornate facade design features and the double windows and the extensive use of arches. Seville was the capital of Moorish Spain. And they created infrastructure that would be considered modern and is still in use. This is a view from Central Park in New York City, with the lovely stone bridge in the foreground and the building with the twin towers and onion domes in the background. Manhattan Henge is quite interesting and noteworthy. This is an annual event during which the setting sun or rising sun is aligned with the east-west street grid of Manhattan on dates evenly spaced around the summer solstice and winter solstice. There are similar alignments with the sun and street plan that occur in other major cities, like Toronto, Baltimore, Chicago, and Montreal. So how did that happen? We certainly don't learn about that level of precise astronomical city planning in North America in our history classes. I have come to the conclusion that beings with a negative agenda for humanity knocked humanity off the positive Moorish timeline in order to control humanity, using humans in wars against each other, the Creator, and creation. I think there is more than one group of negative beings involved in this. Fallen angels, archons, and reptilians, and probably others are involved in what has taken place. I see Paradise Lost, the epic poem by John Milton, as historical non-fiction. This poem was published in 1667. As related in the poem, newly banished fallen angels organize, and Satan volunteers to corrupt the newly created earth and God's new and most favored creation, mankind. He goes to the Garden of Eden and basically convinces Eve, by duplicity, to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and making it their fault they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Whether you know it or not, this is completely relevant to what is playing out in the world today. So how did the negative beings hijack the timeline? I think they did it by manipulating the great dragon lines of the plumed serpent and the rainbow serpent of the planetary grid, and creating a 3D time loop that somehow mirrors or involves the figure 8 on its side of the great dragon lines, which cross each other in two places, Bali in Indonesia and Lake Titicaca in South America, which is located in Peru and Bolivia. I think this 3D time loop called Rome somehow got pinned onto the two great dragon lines between the years 1492, the year of the fall of Granada in Spain, and the year of Columbus's first voyage, and 1942, midway through World War II, and the year of the Philadelphia experiment. Also, the year of 1942 is a numeric anagram to 1492. More on this later in the video. The new timeline was somehow inserted, and everything was grafted onto the existing infrastructure on the planet and falsely attributed in the new historical narrative. The world history we have been taught is filled with war and violence, death and destruction, which was not our original evolutionary path. For another thing, I do not believe that the Catholic Church existed before 1492. This is a star map of the Vatican and Rome, courtesy of Wayne Herschel's work, and how it mirrors the heavens. There is that precise astronomical city planning again. It is important to note that the Moors were master astronomers and builders. There are 450 years in between 1492 and 1942, and halfway, at 225 years, is 1717. I'm going to show you a timeline I've been able to put together through internet research centering around these 3 years, and show you some noteworthy anomalies and occurrences that I was able to find. First, I'm going to point out some things leading up to the 1492 to 1942 time period. I remember first learning about black figure Greek pottery in the 6th grade, 1974 for me, when we studied ancient Greece, where we were taught that the white Greeks had a style called black figure in their pottery art, said to be reminiscent of silhouettes. So here's what this style looks like. Could this possibly mean something quite different from an artistic style? Like the ancient Greeks were actually black and not white, as we have been taught? How about an acknowledged black Roman emperor? In our current historical narrative, Septimus Severus was born in Libya in 145 AD. He ended up in government service in Rome, and really rose through the ranks, becoming emperor from 193 to 211 AD. The defacing of ancient statues and monuments is quite common, with many examples of missing noses, heads, and badly damaged bodies of statues, like these statues of Petra in Jordan. There are statues of people in the alcoves, but they have been rendered unrecognizable. The Sphinx in Egypt is another well-known example of this practice. Legend has it that the troops of Napoleon used it for target practice in 1798. Whatever the reason, this Sphinx's nose is missing. Why? A papal bull is an official papal letter or document, named after the leaden seal used to authenticate it. They figure prominently in the historical narrative we've been given. In 1302, the Unum Sanctum papal bull was issued by Pope Boniface VIII. At the end of it, he writes, "Furthermore, we declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman Pontiff." On December 22, 1216, the Dominican order was founded by Pope Honorius III via his papal bull called the Religiosum Vitam, and gave universal recognition to the order. This occurred during the Albigensian or Cathar Crusade in southern France, and the Cathars were called a heretical sect. The Dominicans were founded to preach the gospel and to oppose heresy. The peaceful Gnostic Cathars were brutally massacred in the Albigensian Crusade that lasted from 1209 to 1229. The Spanish Inquisition was established by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella in 1478 to maintain Catholic orthodoxy. Called the Tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition, it is particularly known in history for its brutality and torture. Now we are arriving at the beginning of the 1492 to 1942 time period. The city of Granada fell on January 2, 1492, effectively ending Moorish rule in Spain when Muhammad XII surrendered the Emirate of Granada to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Shortly thereafter, via the Alhambra decree issued on March 31, 1492, Spanish Jews were given the choice of converting to Catholicism or leaving the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. This decree may have originally applied to the Moors as well. It is out there in the field of information that the next day, April 1st, became known as April Fool's Day, because while the Moors were told they had the same option, their ships and homes were burned, and many were killed. While this may or may not be true, it would not surprise me if it was, and I have read from different sources that this was the case. Columbus left Spain on his first voyage on August 3, 1492, ostensibly to find a westward route to Asia. There's a lot of hidden history that I have encountered around this subject. For the purposes of this video, I just want to point out the date. Then on May 4th, 1493, the Inter Cetera papal bull was issued by Pope Alexander VI. This bull became a major document in the development of subsequent legal doctrines regarding claims of empire in the quote-unquote New World. The bull assigned to Castile the exclusive right to acquire territory, to trade in or even approach the lands lying west of the meridian situated 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands, except for any lands actually possessed by any other Christian prince beyond this meridian prior to Christmas 1492. In 1540, Pope Paul III issued a papal bull forming the Jesuit order under the leadership of Ignatius Loyola, a Basque nobleman from the Pyrenees in northern Spain. The Jesuit order included a special vow of obedience to the Pope in matters of mission, direction, and assignment. In October of 1582, the Gregorian calendar was introduced by Pope Gregory XIII for the given reason of correcting the Julian calendar on stopping the drift of the calendar with respect to the equinoxes, and included the addition of leap years. It took 300 years to implement the calendar in the West, and nowadays it's used in non-Western countries for civil purposes. Could there be another reason why this calendar was imposed, like perhaps to manipulate our perception of time? Indigenous calendrical systems like the Mayan calendar were involved with the harmonization and synchronization of human beings with natural cycles of time. The short count is based on 13 tones and 20 day signs, totaling 260 days. The long count is based on a 5,125-year cycle, measuring much larger cycles of time. During the 1582 to 1589 time period in England, John Dee and Edward Kelly were involved in scrying activities that ended up bringing fallen angels and other negative beings into this dimensional plane. John Dee was considered the most learned man of his time in England and had an extensive library. He also had in his possession a collection of mirrors and other scrying devices. He was an advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. Edward Kelly was an occultist and spirit medium. Again, my main focus is on dates here, but there is much more to this subject in terms of an occultist element associated with dark arts that came directly into England at that time that is very problematic to this day. In 1588, the Spanish Armada was mostly defeated by severe weather when it was on its way to invade England. On December 31st, 1600, the British East India Company was chartered. It was formed to trade with the East Indies, primarily Indonesia and the Philippines, but ended up trading mostly with China, and it seized control of large parts of India. This is the flag of the British East India Company. On March 20th, 1602, the Dutch East India Company was chartered to trade with India and Southeast Asian countries when the Dutch government granted it a 21-year monopoly for the Dutch spice trade. It was an early multinational corporation that existed from 1602 to 1799. In August of 1642, the first voyage of Abel Tasman took place, starting out from Batavia, the capital of the Dutch East Indies, which corresponds to present-day Jakarta, for the purpose of exploring Mauritius, Tasmania, and New Zealand for the Dutch East India Company. Then on January 30th, 1644, Abel Tasman started out on his second voyage for the Dutch East India Company to find a passage to the eastern side of New Holland, which is Australia. He missed the Torres Strait and mapped the north coast of Australia. The years of 1665 and 1666 were when the Great Plague of London took place. This was the last major epidemic of bubonic plague to take place in England. It is said to have killed 100,000 people in 18 months. Between September 2nd and September 6th of the year 1666, the Great Fire of London took place. It swept through the central parts of London and gutted the medieval city of London. The homes of 70,000 inhabitants, out of 80,000 inhabitants that lived there, were destroyed. Quite interestingly, it did not reach the aristocratic district of Westminster and Whitehall. In 1667, as I mentioned previously, John Milton's epic poem, Paradise Lost, was first published. By universal law, all beings are required to inform beings of what they are doing to establish consent for what is taking place. I think that this is what the negative beings were doing with what was available for communication at that time, even though that is not how it was or is advertised. To this day, their intentions are falsely advertised in whatever media they use. It is not informed consent if people don't know that they are being informed. Their techniques are inherently deceptive. On May 2nd, 1670, the Hudson Bay Company was granted a permanent charter by King Charles II of England. It conferred two things on a group of French explorers. One, a trading monopoly with London merchants over the lucrative North American fur trade, and two, gave them effective control over the vast region surrounding the Hudson Bay in Canada. Still in operation today as a Canadian retail business group operating department stores in several countries, it is the oldest corporation in the world. From 1712 to 1784, the Ascended Master Saint Germain is widely believed to have been on earth as the Count of Saint Germain. He achieved prominence in European high society of the mid-1700s for his amazing alchemical abilities and apparent non-aging during those 72 years. Why was he on Earth during this time period? I think he could have been on the Earth plane because of the timeline hijack that had taken place, but I have more anomalous historical occurrences to share in support of this belief as we go along. The year 1717 is the center point between 1492 and 1942. This is what I found happening between 1714 and 1742. In 1714, King George I of the German House of Hanover becomes King of Great Britain and Ireland. This marked the end of the rule of the House of Stuart, which originated in Scotland. This is King James I of England / King James VI of Scotland, the King James Version of the Bible, King James. On January 4th, 1717, Great Britain, France, and the Dutch Republic signed the Triple Alliance in an attempt to maintain the Treaty of Utrecht, which was signed in April of 1713, in which, in order to become King of Spain, Philip had to renounce his concurrent claim to the French throne. This prevented the thrones of Spain and France from merging together and ultimately paved the way for the maritime, commercial, and financial supremacy of Great Britain. In February of 1717, James Francis Edward Stuart of the House of Stuart, called the Pretender, who at one time was claimant to the throne, left where he was living in France after the Triple Alliance was signed in January to seek exile with Pope Clement XI in Rome. Why he went specifically there I don't know, but he died in Rome in 1766. While most portraits online are of a white person, this is believed to be a portrait of James Francis Edward Stuart that was painted when he lived in France. On June 24, 1717, the premier Grand Lodge of England, the first Freemason Grand Lodge, was founded in London. I understand the truth about Masonry and the Moors, so I find it highly significant that this event shows up at the exact midpoint year between 1492 and 1942. And then on July 17, 1717, or 7/17/1717, an interesting date from a numerological perspective, the premiere of Georg Friedrich Handel's water music took place for King George I on a barge on the Thames. Eyes are now on Handel. In 1727, Georg Friedrich Handel, the German, becomes George Frederick Handel, a British citizen. Then I was guided through a psychic friend to look at Ireland in 1742, so I searched for it on the internet and only two things came up. The first was that Dublin, Ireland was a location for the premiere of George Frederick Handel's Messiah on April 13, 1742. The second is that between 1740 and 1741 there was an extraordinary weather event in Ireland involving extreme cold. There's a book about it entitled Arctic Ireland. During this time in Ireland, there was an almost 2-year period of extremely cold, enduring weather. The cause is not known, and this information is in the historical record, but kept pretty much out of sight. Hundreds of thousands of people died in the cold snap, about 1/5 of the population at the time. To this day, it is one of the longest periods of extreme cold in modern European history, and it led to food riots, famine, epidemics, and death. And then Handel's Messiah premieres in Dublin the following spring like nothing had just happened? What if the explanation involves a disruption in the fabric of space-time? What if the brand new Rome timeline was pinned over Ireland? If you look on a globe, Ireland is definitely in a curved alignment with Bali and Lake Titicaca, the two crossing points of the great earth dragons. The Irish population endured 21 months of bizarre weather without known precedent that defied conventional explanation. The cause is not known. What might this event allow to happen? So far during this time period, around 1717, we find the new British monarch coming from Germany, the Stuart heir exiled in Rome, and Handel shows up on the scene from Germany, premiering on a numerological date and after an extremely severe anomalous weather event in Ireland. So who else shows up during this time period? Well, for one, in 1744, Mayer Rothschild was born in Frankfurt, Germany. He established his banking business there in the 1760s, which became the start of an international banking family. Then on February 6, 1748, Adam Weishaupt was born in Ingolstadt, Bavaria, Germany. He went to a Jesuit school at the age of 7. He founded the Bavarian Order of the Illuminati on May 1, 1776, and was initiated into Freemasonry in 1777. So fast forward to the time period of November 20th to November 30th of 1910. A meeting took place at Jekyll Island off the coast of the state of Georgia to lay the foundations for the Federal Reserve. On April 15, 1912, the Titanic sank. Another space-time event occurred as all the bankers opposed to the creation of the Federal Reserve were on board, including John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest people in the world at the time. Then on December 23, 1913, the Federal Reserve Act passed Congress, signed into law by Woodrow Wilson. It created and established the Federal Reserve System and created the authority to issue Federal Reserve notes, commonly known as the U.S. dollar, as legal tender. World War I started on July 28, 1914, and ended on November 11, 1918. It was one of the largest wars in history, with 70 million military personnel mobilized, and of that number, 60 million were Europeans. An estimated 9 million combatants died as a direct result of the war, and 7 million civilians, and many more died as an indirect consequence of this war. Now here's that 17 showing up again. On July 17, 1917, or 7/17/1917, the reigning royal house of the United Kingdom and its Commonwealth, the House of Windsor, is founded after the death of Queen Victoria. It is also of German paternal descent. World War II started on September 1, 1939, and ended on September 2 in 1945, exactly 6 years later. It is considered the deadliest conflict in human history. Almost halfway through World War II, on July 22, 1942, the strange Philadelphia experiment took place at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. These next slides give an overview of the experiment. Did the USS Eldridge just become invisible, or did it go somewhere else? And if it went somewhere else, where might it have gone? The timeline and examples I have given provide a framework. There is still much to be accounted for because of all the fabrication and whitewashing that has taken place. So exactly what they did and when they did it to accomplish all of the whitewash and historical rewrite, I really don't know. However, there are patterns going on in what I have said here that if you can see and understand them, you will understand and recognize more about what has actually been taking place on Earth without our knowledge and consent. I bring this information to light for awareness, healing, and transmutation for the highest good and the greatest need of all. Victory of the light, and so it is done.